The story began innocently enough, during a Friday night poker game with some old friends. I was listening to Gary, one of my closest friends since college, as he narrated another one of his absurd stories about his chaotic work life. He was a lawyer, known for his wit and charm, and tonight, his story involved a hilarious courtroom mishap. As we laughed, Gary leaned back and, almost offhandedly, mentioned something that left me unsettled. "People these days are scandalous, I tell you. Just last week, I handled a case where a wife was sneaking around behind her husband's back." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Can you imagine? The poor guy never saw it coming." Everyone at the table laughed, but I found myself shifting uncomfortably in my chair. Gary's comment stuck in my mind like a thorn, its edges sharp and unyielding. Why had it bothered me so much? It wasn't like Rachel, my wife, was acting any different. Or was she? The thought nagged at me the entire way home. Rachel had been distant lately. There were the missed dinners, the late nights at work she mentioned almost offhandedly, like they were too normal to bother explaining. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the gnawing feeling wouldn't leave. That night, I lay awake in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, wondering why my mind was going there. The following morning, while Rachel was still asleep, I was heading out to the grocery store when I caught sight of her phone on the counter. She'd left it out, something she never did. And that's when I noticed the blinking notification on her lock screen, a message from someone saved as simply, "Jay." I hesitated, my hand hovering above the screen. I shouldn't check. But the suspicion, it was eating at me. My heart pounded as I tapped the screen, reading only the preview of the message. "Can't wait to see you again." The words hit like a punch. I could hardly breathe as I let her phone slip back onto the counter. The message was just a few words, but it had already planted a deep, gnawing seed of doubt in my mind. I stood there, staring at that screen, feeling like my whole world was on the edge of collapsing. Part of me wanted to shake her awake and demand an explanation right then and there, but another part, the part that knew I needed more than one stray text message, held me back. I left for the grocery store, but I could barely focus. Rachel was in my thoughts the entire time. Who was Jay? Was it an old friend? Someone from work? I tried to think back, to remember if she'd ever mentioned someone with that initial, but nothing came to mind. By the time I returned, she was up and making breakfast, smiling at me like everything was normal. That weekend, I started paying closer attention to her. At first, it was small things, the way she'd casually leave the room to answer calls, the times she'd say she was heading out for errands but would come back hours later. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, but as each day passed, my suspicion grew. Then, on Monday, I found the first real clue. I'd taken Rachel's car that morning because mine was due for a service. As I slid into the driver's seat, something felt off. The car smelled different, like a faint trace of cologne that wasn't mine. I tried to ignore it, dismissing it as paranoia, but then I saw it, a small, crumpled foil package, peeking out from under the passenger seat. A condom wrapper. The sight of it made my stomach twist, my chest tighten. I couldn't move. My hand hovered over that damn wrapper, half tempted to leave it right there and pretend I'd never seen it. But curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the best of me. I reached down and picked it up, staring at the shiny foil as my mind raced. My throat felt dry, and my hands began to tremble. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, some simple reason that would make all of this disappear. But the questions wouldn't stop flooding my mind. Who would bring a condom into our car? The implication hung heavy in the air, even as I tried to push it away. It didn't make sense, though. Rachel hadn't had my car recently, but she'd driven hers. She'd borrowed it on Friday when she said she had to run some work errands. She hadn't explained why she needed it instead of her own, but I hadn't thought to ask. Now, with the evidence in my hand, all I could think about was that message from Jay. I tossed the wrapper in the trash, but my mind wouldn't let it go. The rest of the day at work, I couldn't focus. Every task felt pointless, like trying to hold a conversation underwater. All I could think about was getting home, confronting her, and demanding an explanation. But when I walked through the door that evening, the determination faded. Rachel greeted me with her usual warm smile, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day was. She was so casual, so normal, that it threw me off balance. If she were hiding something, how could she act this calm? How could she look me in the eye and pretend everything was fine? Dinner was a blur. I kept glancing at her, trying to pick apart her expressions, her movements, anything to give away a hidden truth. I nearly asked her about the car right then, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I wanted to be sure. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. The last thing I wanted was to ruin my marriage over a misunderstanding. And then, just as we were clearing the table, Rachel's phone buzzed again. This time, she was right beside me, and I saw her tense up as she looked at the screen. Her face paled for just a split second before she slipped the phone into her pocket, muttering something about work texts. My stomach nodded. It was Jay, it had to be. But she excused herself, saying she needed to make a quick call, disappearing down the hall with her phone clutched tightly in her hand. As she spoke softly into the phone, I stood frozen, straining to catch even a hint of her conversation. But I couldn't hear much, just a low murmur of words, and then she laughed. That sound, once so familiar, now felt like a dagger. The warmth, the way her tone softened, she'd used that laugh with me 100 times. When she returned a few minutes later, she was all smiles, her expression smooth as ever. Sorry about that, she said breezily, dropping her phone on the counter like it was no big deal. Work's just been so hectic. I forced a smile, my jaw tight. I get it, I replied, trying to keep my tone even. But inside I was screaming. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in some twisted version of reality, where my wife was both present and a stranger. I watched her laugh, talk, move around the house, and every gesture felt tainted by suspicion. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling long after Rachel had fallen asleep. I felt trapped in a maze of my own thoughts, second-guessing every moment, every glance, every time she'd left the house in the past few weeks. The doubt had burrowed its way deep, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to shake it. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. I couldn't keep living with these endless questions, the second-guessing. I'd give myself a week. Just 7 days to find out what was really going on. If I had proof, I'd confront her. If not, I'd force myself to let it go. Rachel was already up, moving around in the kitchen, humming to herself as she made breakfast. It was strange, she seemed almost lighter, like she was carrying a secret that thrilled her. I watched her from the doorway, feeling like I was seeing her through a fractured lens. The woman I'd known for years, now layered with shadows and mysteries. But she glanced up, catching my gaze, and smiled as though everything were normal. I pushed down the unease and sat at the table, pretending to enjoy the meal. She chatted about her day, her plans for the weekend, and I found myself nodding along, barely hearing her words. My mind was already racing through scenarios, ideas of how I'd catch her if there was something to catch. I kept my responses casual, asking her where she'd be that day, what time she'd be home. Later, when I saw her car pull out of the driveway, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed her laptop and powered it up. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but it was the only place I hadn't searched. She wasn't the type to delete things, and if there was anything hidden, I figured it might be there. But as I scrolled through emails and messages, there was nothing. Just work emails, her usual newsletters, and family updates. Nothing suspicious. Frustrated, I was about to give up when I noticed a calendar notification pop up on the screen. An appointment for later that night, simply labeled dinner. She hadn't mentioned dinner plans. Not with me, anyway. I clicked on it, feeling a wave of hope that quickly sank when I saw there were no further details. Just dinner, and the address of some trendy new restaurant downtown. I'd heard her mention it to a friend last week, saying she wanted to try it sometime. Now I wondered if Jay would be joining her. When Rachel got home that evening, I kept my tone light, acting as though everything was perfectly normal. But I had already made my decision. If she was going to this dinner, I would be there too, even if she didn't know it. "Do you have any plans tonight?" I asked as we ate dinner in tense silence. She looked up, her face briefly clouded with something that looked like guilt, but she quickly recovered, nodding. "Oh, yeah, I'm meeting a friend for dinner," she replied, her voice casual. "It was kind of a last-minute thing." "Oh? Which friend?" I asked, keeping my tone light, as if I were merely curious. She hesitated, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her napkin. Janine. From the office," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "It's been ages since we caught up." I nodded, pretending to believe her, but my mind was already racing. There was no Janine from her office. I knew most of her colleagues, had even met them at company events. And as she smiled at me, trying to act nonchalant, I knew, without a doubt, that she was lying. "Have fun," I managed, forcing a smile as she got up to leave. She kissed me on the cheek and lingered a moment, as though checking if I suspected anything, before grabbing her purse and heading out the door. The moment she was gone, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I kept a safe distance, careful to stay out of sight, watching as she drove through town and finally parked outside the restaurant. She got out, checking her reflection in the car window before heading inside. I stayed in the shadows across the street, feeling my heart pound as I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I was about to lose hope when I saw him, a man with dark hair and a confident smile, striding up to the restaurant entrance. Rachel's face lit up when she saw him, and they hugged in a way that felt too comfortable, too familiar. My chest tightened as I watched them enter the restaurant, his arm lightly resting on her lower back. I stood there, frozen, watching them disappear inside, my heart pounding as the truth stared me in the face. Standing there, I felt like an intruder in my own life, an outsider peering into a scene I was never meant to witness. I waited until the door had closed behind them, the image of their easy smiles seared into my mind. She looked happy, more carefree than I'd seen her in months. And with a stranger. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and headed across the street. The restaurant was warm and dimly lit, candles on every table casting flickering shadows. I scanned the room quickly, hoping to avoid being noticed, until I spotted them tucked away in a cozy corner booth. She had her back to me, her shoulders relaxed as she leaned in close to him, her face lit with a glow I hadn't seen in far too long. The sight of her laughing with him, their heads just inches apart, made my heart pound harder, but I forced myself to focus. I couldn't afford to lose control, not here, not now. Instead, I found a spot at the bar, where I could keep them in sight but stay out of view. I ordered a drink and tried to blend in, glancing over occasionally, watching their every move. At one point, she reached across the table, placing her hand over his. They lingered like that, fingers lightly intertwined, and I felt something inside me snap. I wanted to storm over, to pull her hand away, to demand answers. But the bartender's voice broke my thoughts, bringing me back to reality as he set my drink down with a friendly smile. "Rough night?" he asked, his eyes flicking toward Rachel and her friend as if he'd caught me staring. I forced a quick nod, gritting my teeth to keep from saying too much. Over the next hour, I watched them laugh, lean in close, share what looked like an intimate conversation. The man, I still didn't know his name, would say something, and Rachel would throw her head back, laughing in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was torture, but I couldn't pull myself away. I had to know. I had to see this play out, no matter how much it hurt. And then, just as I was considering confronting them, I saw something that made my blood run cold. She pulled out a small gift from her purse, a neatly wrapped package, and handed it across the table. He grinned, his face lighting up as he took it from her. I couldn't hear what she said, but I could see the fondness in her eyes. The way she looked at him was painfully familiar, a look I'd once thought was reserved for me. I felt my fists clench as he opened the box, pulling out a silver bracelet that she must have picked out herself. He looked touched, slipping it onto his wrist, and then reaching across the table to brush her cheek with his fingers. She blushed, glancing around as if worried someone might see, and for a moment I hoped she'd notice me. That she'd see the hurt on my face and stop whatever this was. But she didn't. She just leaned in and let him kiss her cheek, smiling shyly as she whispered something in his ear. The sight of it shattered whatever hope I'd been clinging to. I could have looked past the late nights, the secrets, maybe even the lies. But seeing her give him a gift, watching her let him touch her so openly, that was the last straw. I stood up, ready to end this, to confront them right there in the middle of the restaurant. But as I took a step toward their table, I caught a glimpse of myself in a nearby mirror. My face was pale, my jaw clenched, eyes dark with pain. I realized I couldn't do it, not here, not in front of strangers. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing how deeply she'd hurt me. Instead, I turned and walked out, leaving her to her new life. Outside, I stumbled into the cool night air, my mind spinning. I stood there for a long moment, trying to collect myself, but the images kept flooding back, her laughter, her hand on his, the way she looked at him like he was her entire world. In that moment, I knew I had to find out who he was. I needed answers even if they hurt. I needed to know everything. The next morning, I felt hollow, running on nothing but anger and a sickening determination to uncover the truth. Rachel was already gone by the time I got up, her side of the bed cold. I checked my phone, half expecting some explanation from her, an apology even. But there was nothing. Just a text left unread from last night. Working late, don't wait up. The memory of her at the restaurant with that man was seared into my mind. I couldn't get rid of the image of her hand resting on his, the way she laughed at his every word, or the shy, affectionate glance she gave him when she thought no one was watching. It all felt surreal, like I was living someone else's nightmare. Determined, I headed out, phone in hand. I needed to know more about him, and if she wasn't going to tell me, I'd figure it out myself. I drove to the restaurant, hoping to find some answers. When I arrived, the place was quiet, staff just setting up tables for the lunch rush. I walked up to the hostess, putting on a friendly smile to mask the nerves coiling in my stomach. "Hey, I was here last night with my wife and a friend," I said casually, hoping I didn't sound as desperate as I felt. "We forgot something here, and I was wondering if you remember the guy she was sitting with, tall, dark hair?" She looked at me suspiciously, but then nodded. "I think I know who you mean. He comes in here often. We call him Jake." She paused, glancing at me before adding, "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied, managing a small, tight smile. "Just a small misunderstanding." Jake. That was my first clue, a name to go with the face that had haunted my thoughts since last night. I thanked her and left the restaurant, my mind racing. Now I had a name, but I needed more. I needed to know exactly who this guy was, why he was so important to Rachel, and just how long this had been going on. After some quick searching online, I found him. His profile popped up on social media with a professional headshot, a marketing executive who, according to his profile, had just moved to the area about 6 months ago. Single. Active. Charismatic. His feed was filled with posts about work, his travels, and a few cryptic photos that felt almost too familiar. And there, in one photo from a couple of months back, I saw it, a bracelet, just like the one Rachel had given him at the restaurant. The ache in my chest deepened. This wasn't a casual fling. This was something more. There was a connection between them, a bond that couldn't be brushed off as a meaningless encounter. I scrolled through his feed, looking for any sign of her, a photo, a hint, anything. But he was careful. There were no photos of her, no obvious clues. Yet the fact that he was wearing the bracelet told me everything I needed to know. The next few days passed in a haze. Every time I saw Rachel, I tried to act normal, but the resentment was building, tightening inside me like a coil. She continued her routine as if nothing was wrong, smiling at me, making small talk, asking about my day. It was infuriating, knowing she was keeping this secret while pretending to be the same devoted wife she'd always been. On Friday night, just after dinner, she mentioned she'd be working late again. I didn't bother asking any questions. I already knew what working late meant. She left, and I waited exactly 15 minutes before grabbing my keys and following her. This time, she drove out to a quiet residential area on the other side of town, parking in front of a modest, single-story house with a light on in the front window. I parked a few houses down, watching as she walked up to the door, and after a moment it opened. Jake stood there, greeting her with a warm smile. He looked exactly as he had in his photos, charming, casual, with that easy confidence that seemed to have drawn her in from the start. I felt a sickening twist of jealousy, a hollow ache as I watched her step inside, closing the door behind her without so much as a glance back. I sat there, feeling like a stranger in my own life. The shock, the anger, the frustration, it all swirled together, threatening to pull me under. This was it. The truth was undeniable. She was having an affair. But somehow, instead of feeling defeated, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This was the moment I had feared, the moment I had dreaded. Yet now that it was happening, I felt calm, almost detached. I stayed in my car, watching the minutes tick by, wondering what was happening behind that door. I imagined them talking, laughing, sharing some private joke, building a world that didn't include me. I had a decision to make. I could confront them right here, break down the door and force them to face me. Or I could walk away. After a while, I took out my phone and snapped a picture of her car in his driveway, a small, undeniable piece of evidence. I didn't know if I'd ever use it, but something about it felt final, like I was closing a chapter of my life. With that, I started the engine and drove off into the night, leaving them behind. The weekend passed in silence. I barely spoke to Rachel, and when she did speak to me, I responded with as few words as possible, my mind numb. I could tell she was beginning to notice the shift, the growing distance I no longer bothered to hide. She would catch my gaze and tilt her head slightly, her eyes questioning. I could feel her watching me, likely wondering if I knew. But I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. I wanted her to feel it. To feel what it was like when the walls started closing in. On Monday morning, after Rachel left for work, I began gathering every piece of evidence I'd collected. The messages I'd seen on her phone from Jay, the image of her car parked in his driveway, the memory of that bracelet, and the dinner they'd shared. I organized everything, knowing that if I ever chose to confront her, I'd leave no room for denials or excuses. A few hours later, I met up with a friend of mine, Greg. He'd been my college roommate, and now worked as a private investigator. I hadn't planned on involving anyone else, but I couldn't take the silence any longer. Greg knew me well, could see through my forced calm, and after an hour of listening, he offered his services. "Look, man," Greg said, leaning back in his chair. "I can help you find out everything. I'll get you proof. Solid, undeniable proof." I hesitated but finally agreed. "Just find out how long this has been going on. I need the truth." Greg nodded. "I'll get you what you need. But be careful, Jack. Sometimes the truth isn't what you're ready to hear." I spent the next few days caught between dread and anticipation. Every time I heard my phone buzz, my heart would lurch, hoping it was Greg with an update. But days passed with nothing but silence. Meanwhile, Rachel continued her charade, pretending as though everything was perfectly fine. She made dinner, she laughed at old jokes, she even suggested we plan a trip for our anniversary. The pretense was infuriating, but I played along, biting my tongue, watching her closely as the web of lies tightened around her. Then, on Thursday night, Greg called. "You're not going to like this," he said, his voice cautious. "But I found out who Jake really is." I braced myself, feeling a chill run through me. "What do you mean?" Greg hesitated. "He's not just some random guy, Jack. Jake's a client of hers, one she's been working with closely for the past 6 months. It looks like she's been meeting him regularly under the pretense of work. But there's more, he's been to your house, Jack. They met up there while you were away on a business trip last month." The room spun as Greg's words sank in. Jake had been in my house. The image of him sitting on my couch, walking through my home, spending time in the space I'd built with Rachel, our home, sent a wave of nausea through me. But Greg wasn't done. "There's something else," he said, his voice softer now, as if he were hesitant to share. "I've got a security photo from the night he stayed over. Jack, they were in your bedroom. Together." My heart dropped. The betrayal wasn't just an affair, it was woven into the very fabric of my life, down to the sheets I slept on. It wasn't just a distant fling. It was a part of her life she'd brazenly brought into our own home. I felt like a fool, a stranger in my own life, blindsided by someone I'd trusted with everything. "Thanks, Greg," I managed, my voice hollow. I hung up and sat there in the silence, staring at the evidence he'd sent me, the photos, the details, the timestamps. They painted a picture that left no doubt she'd betrayed me in every possible way. Hours later, I heard the front door open. Rachel stepped inside, calling out my name with her usual, cheerful voice, as if nothing had changed. She didn't realize that everything had changed. "Hey, Jack," she said, setting down her bag and walking into the living room. "How was your day?" I watched her carefully, keeping my tone steady. "Fine. Busy." She nodded, moving toward me, and for a moment, her eyes flickered with something close to concern. "Are you okay? You've seemed a little distant." The irony of her question nearly made me laugh. But instead, I just looked at her, wondering how I'd managed to share a life with someone so skilled at deception. I thought back to the image of her and Jake in our room, the late nights, the lingering looks, and I felt a surge of bitterness. "Actually, I'm not okay," I said quietly, my voice firmer than I'd intended. "In fact, there's a lot I need to talk to you about." She froze, the color draining from her face as she looked at me, her eyes widening slightly. Rachel's face shifted, a flicker of panic in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I saw her swallow, her hands fidgeting as she tried to compose herself. What do you mean, Jack?" Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. I held her gaze, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "Why don't you sit down?" She hesitated, glancing toward the doorway as if debating whether she should make a run for it. But finally, she lowered herself onto the couch across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I could tell she was already crafting her story, preparing the lies she thought would explain everything. But I wasn't going to let her twist this. I wasn't going to give her a single inch of space to deny it. "I know about Jake," I said, my voice steady, the name hanging heavily between us. "I know about the messages, the late nights, the dinners, and the fact that he's been in our home." I kept my tone even, forcing myself to stay calm, but inside, every word felt like a knife. Her face paled, and she stared at me, her expression frozen in shock. "Jack! I shook my head, cutting her off. "Don't lie, Rachel. Don't insult me by pretending this is anything but what it is." I pulled out my phone, swiping through the photos Greg had sent, and held it up for her to see. "I have proof. I've known for a while now, but I wanted to hear it from you." She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears. She started to shake her head, but then, as if realizing there was no point in denying it, she stopped. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Like this?" I scoffed, the bitterness finally breaking through my composure. "How exactly did you think I'd find out, Rachel? Were you planning to tell me at all?" She looked up, her expression a mix of guilt and desperation. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Jake and it just happened." "Just happened?" The words tasted bitter on my tongue. "Do you think that makes it any easier to hear? Do you think that makes this any less of a betrayal?" I felt my anger rising, boiling over, and I didn't try to stop it. I'd held it back for too long. Rachel flinched, her hands twisting together in her lap as she tried to explain. "Jack, I was lonely. You've been so busy with work, so distant. I felt invisible. I know that doesn't make this okay, but. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my voice level. So this is my fault now? You're blaming me for your affair? No, that's not what I'm saying, she cried, her face crumpling. I'm just trying to explain how I felt. I didn't want to hurt you, Jack. I swear. I didn't want any of this to happen. I shook my head, the weight of her words crashing down on me. You didn't want it to happen, but you let him into our home. You let him into our bed. You took everything we built, everything we had, and threw it away without a second thought. She broke down, sobbing into her hands. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity, but mostly emptiness. The woman in front of me, crying and begging, felt like a stranger. The Rachel I knew would never have done this. After a few moments, she looked up, her face streaked with tears. Please, Jack. I know I don't deserve it, but is there any chance we can fix this? I want to make things right. I love you, I really do. This was a mistake, a horrible, stupid mistake, but it doesn't change how I feel about you. I stared at her, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. Part of me wanted to believe her, to reach out and take her hand, to somehow find a way to undo the damage that had been done. But the images, the lies, the deceit, it was all too much. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Rachel, I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't unsee what I've seen. Maybe you did love me once, and maybe part of you still does, but that doesn't erase the fact that you betrayed me in every possible way. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, her hands reaching out toward me. Please, Jack. Don't throw us away. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything you want. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on me. I had spent so many years with her, building a life, a future. But now, it felt like that future had been shattered beyond repair. I stood up, pacing the room, feeling the weight of her plea. I wanted to shout, to break something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd inflicted. But instead I looked at her, taking in the face of the woman I'd once thought I'd grow old with, the one I'd trusted with every vulnerable piece of me. Rachel, I began slowly, trying to rein in the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. How can I ever trust you again? Every late night, every work dinner, every time you're on your phone, how will I know you're telling the truth? I shook my head, trying to steady my voice. Trust doesn't just come back because you say you're sorry. She sat there, hands clasped tightly in her lap, silent. I could see her struggling to find the words, but what could she say? There was no way to undo what she'd done, and I could tell she knew it too. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I know I've ruined everything, Jack. But please, just give me a chance to make things right. I'll do anything, whatever it takes to rebuild that trust. I love you, and I don't want to lose you. I felt a pang in my chest, a dull ache beneath the layers of anger. She was right. We'd spent years together, weathered storms, shared dreams, built a life. But what she was asking wasn't simple. It wasn't as easy as promising to fix things and move on. I don't know if that's possible, I said, my voice sounding foreign, hollow. I don't know if there's anything left to rebuild. I looked at her, trying to find some trace of the person I thought I knew. The truth is, Rachel, I don't even recognize you anymore. The silence hung between us, thick and suffocating. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Her face crumpled, and she let out a soft, shaky breath. Please, Jack. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but don't give up on us. Give me one chance. Let me prove to you that I can be the woman you fell in love with. Her words lingered in the air, and I felt myself wavering, torn between the anger that screamed for justice and the memories of a life we'd once shared. Despite everything, a part of me still felt tethered to her, to the life we built. I wanted to believe there was a way out of this mess. A way to salvage something from the wreckage. But then, the image of her with Jake, her laughter, the bracelet, the touch on his hand, all of it flooded back, tightening the ache in my chest. I need space, Rachel, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I need to figure out if there's anything left here to save. Her face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but she nodded, seeming to understand that this was as close to hope as she was going to get. I'll give you space, Jack, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'll do whatever it takes. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the silence, with the consequences of her choices. That night, I packed a bag, throwing in a few essentials. I couldn't stay here, not with the weight of her betrayal filling every room, lingering on every surface. I needed time, distance, a chance to clear my mind and figure out what I truly wanted. I called Greg, explaining that I was going away for a few days, and he offered me a place to stay. I thanked him but declined. I needed solitude, somewhere quiet to let my thoughts settle. He suggested a cabin he knew about, tucked away in the woods, offering peace and privacy, exactly what I needed. Before leaving, I looked around the house one last time. This place had been my sanctuary, a home I'd poured my heart into building, filled with memories of laughter, love, and the life I'd thought we were sharing. But now, it felt like a stranger's house, a hollow shell that no longer belonged to me. I drove for hours, letting the road unwind beneath me, the familiar landmarks fading as the city gave way to open fields and dense forests. Finally, just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I arrived at the cabin, a small, rustic structure surrounded by towering trees, a place that felt worlds away from everything I was leaving behind. Inside, I collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion weighing me down as the reality of everything hit me. The anger, the hurt, the disbelief, all of it settled heavily in my chest, refusing to let me breathe. For the first time in days, I let myself feel it all, the raw, unfiltered grief of betrayal. I stayed there for what felt like hours, watching as the sun rose higher, casting its light through the trees, illuminating the room in a soft, peaceful glow. I felt the silence settle over me, calm yet heavy, filling the space where anger and resentment had been. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder what life would look like on my own, free from the lies, the deceit, the broken promises. A life where I could rebuild, rediscover, and maybe, one day, even find love again with someone who saw me, valued me, and loved me without reservation. It was a thought I hadn't let myself consider until now, but as I sat there in the quiet, the idea began to grow, taking root in a way I hadn't expected. Maybe, just maybe, I'd find happiness again. The next few days at the cabin felt like stepping out of one life and into another. I spent my time in solitude, letting the calmness of the forest wash over me, giving space to thoughts I hadn't dared acknowledge before. I woke each morning with a little more clarity, the weight on my chest lifting, replaced by something new, possibility. I thought of Rachel often, of course. Her tearful face, her desperate promises. For years, we'd built a life together, layer by layer, every moment contributing to a story I'd believed was unbreakable. But now, that life felt like a story I'd outgrown, the pages yellowed and worn. Sitting there in the quiet, I knew I had a choice, to return and attempt to piece together a fractured past, or to walk away and build something entirely new. And for the first time, I felt at peace with the idea of moving on. On the third day, I decided to go into town for some supplies. I hadn't planned on speaking to anyone, but as I stepped into a small coffee shop, I heard a voice behind me, a woman's voice, soft and friendly. "Long day in the woods?" she asked with a smile as I turned to face her. She was sitting alone, a coffee in one hand, a book open on the table in front of her. Her eyes held a warmth I hadn't seen in a long time, and her smile felt genuine, free from any hidden agenda. I managed a small chuckle. "You could say that. Escaping for a bit. Needed a change of scenery." She tilted her head, studying me curiously. "Escaping? I know the feeling. Sometimes you have to step away to see things clearly." Her words struck a chord. We ended up talking for a while, about simple things, the beauty of the area, the best trails nearby, the occasional wildlife sightings. She introduced herself as Emily, a writer who had moved to the area recently for inspiration. She was thoughtful, her gaze steady, her words sincere. It was easy, natural, like talking to an old friend. There was no weight, no history to complicate things, just the warmth of a new connection. As we spoke, I felt something I hadn't expected, a flicker of excitement, a spark I thought I'd lost. It wasn't love, of course, or even attraction, but the realization that maybe there was life after Rachel. Maybe there was more waiting for me than I'd ever imagined. I returned to the cabin that evening feeling lighter, Emily's words echoing in my mind. Sometimes you have to step away to see things clearly. I thought about that as I watched the sunset through the trees, feeling a strange mixture of grief and hope. The next day, I sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the forest, and I made a decision. I wouldn't return to the life I'd known, not with Rachel. I knew that whatever we'd had was gone, tainted by too many lies, too much betrayal. And while part of me would always feel sadness for what we'd lost, I also knew that this decision was a new beginning. A chance to rebuild, to discover who I was without the weight of a broken marriage. When I got back to the city, I called Rachel. She answered on the first ring, her voice tentative, filled with the hope I could no longer give her. "Jack?" she asked, barely breathing. "Yes, Rachel," I said, my voice steady. "We need to talk." We met in a quiet park, surrounded by the soft sounds of birds and distant laughter. She looked different, tired, her face drawn, as if the weight of her choices had finally settled on her shoulders. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, but I reminded myself of why I was here, why we were doing this. "Rachel, I've thought about everything," I began, watching her closely. "And I've realized that I can't go back. I can't unsee what's happened, and I don't think I can ever truly forgive it. Maybe someday I'll feel differently, but right now I need to move on." Her face crumpled, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached for my hand, but I gently pulled away, feeling a finality in the gesture. I could see the pain in her eyes, the regret, but I knew that this was the best decision for both of us. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, Jack." "I know you are," I replied softly, feeling a strange peace settle over me. "But sometimes sorry isn't enough. Sometimes things just change." With that, we parted ways, our lives moving in opposite directions. The weight I'd been carrying lifted, and as I walked back to my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, a feeling of release from the chains of the past. Months later, I returned to the little cabin, seeking the same peace it had given me before. And this time, I brought someone with me, Emily. We'd stayed in touch after our first meeting, our connection slowly deepening, growing into something I hadn't dared hope for. She walked beside me now, laughing, pointing out small details in the forest I'd never noticed before. And as we stood on the cabin's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew that this was where I was meant to be. Not in a life defined by betrayal, but in a place of new beginnings, surrounded by hope, honesty, and a future I could finally embrace. With Emily by my side, I'd found something I thought I'd lost forever: happiness. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.